All right, welcome everyone. I would like to welcome our guest speakers. I would like to thank all the participants. We apologize for starting a bit late, and interpretation is available in both English and Arabic, and hopefully we don't speak too quickly for that. Welcome all. My name is Reem Mujahid. I work at the Sana Center as a program director. I would like to start by introducing the Sana Center. Sana Center is an independent think tank aiming to create a change through knowledge production with a special focus on Yemen and the surrounding region. The Sana Center publishes its research in both English and Arabic, and it was founded in 2014. This session and this study that we're going to be focusing on today is a part of the project named Women's Voices at the Decision-Making Table. And this project, which is called the SOT project, but which aims to support the political participation of Arabic women, is funded by the EU in partnership with the Arab Reform Initiative, and it is implemented by a coalition of think tanks and organizations in Yemen. For example, the Sana'a Center and the comprehensive department of the American University in Beirut, the Arab Reform Initiative in Syria, and a number of other civil society partners and several other countries in the region. Today we have two interesting guests who are going to be going through them. We'll start with my colleague Bilqis Al-Lahabi, who is the gender advisor at the Sana'a Center. We also have Dr. Maryam Alkubati, who has a PhD in political sociology from the University of Tsukuba in Japan. Maryam has worked with a number of NGOs on several fields of research, like the Gaika Obata Center, the Doha Center for Graduate Studies, and her research has primarily focused on the political participation of women and the role in peace building and gender-based violence in the Middle East and North Africa, and she's the primary researcher for this project. We also have our dear friend Huda Jafar, who is a writer and researcher, specializes in monitoring and evaluation, and she is also an art and film critic and is someone who is well known in Yemen in the field of cinema and the arts. We also have Leila Shabibi from Adan, who is a women's rights activist and a peace builder. She is the executive director of the Akun Foundation and works as an activist to support the implementation and mainstreaming of Resolution 1325 in Yemen. Leila is also a member of the Coalition of Female Defenders of Human Rights in the MENA region and is a trainer with the NDI. Last but not least, we have Sara Al-Jabri, who is a project manager at the Al-Usra Saida Foundation, which is a charitable organization working on women's childhood. She studied law and is a community activist on women, peace building, and conflict resolution. Today, we're going to be speaking about discussing the research, but in addition to the research, we will also take questions on the topic or the main idea for this research. When I read the draft of this research, I thought that how men, and especially men, either because they feel guilty or for whatever other reason, or an appreciation for those who had died during wars, they have brought up the idea of unknown soldier, of people who have fought for victory or who have participated in the war, but whose names are not known. And these sacrifices were commemorated under this idea. And this unknown soldier is something that women do every single day during conflict. Whether in victory or in defeat, women make great sacrifices, and usually this is unrecognized or even unseen. And these efforts are, even if they are seen by others, are underappreciated despite women's role in alleviating the role or the cost of a conflict. This is what we will focus on today. The daily struggles of women, what they have done and why they are doing that. Today we're going to start with our guest speakers. We'll start with Maryam, who will share an important part of the research that they conducted with Huda Jafar, and then we will hear from Leila and Sarah. Go ahead, Maryam.
Should I start?
Should I start?
Okay. So just hold on. I would like to share my screen. Share screen.
Sorry to interrupt, Maryam, but before Maryam starts with her presentation, could we please ask all of the speakers whose names or the participants whose names are not seen on the account, if you could please rename your account or your username so that we can see clearly who is there. You can choose the rename function, and it would make it easier if someone asks a question or asks to speak. It'll be easier to do so with the full names. Thank you, and I apologize, Maryam.
So I'll be speaking in English from here on. So first of all, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll get right to it. My name is Maryam Alkubati, and I'm the lead researcher on this project. I'll be talking about our report findings, which was published, I think, yesterday on Sana Center's website. So please check it out when you can. So today's webinar focuses on a community-centered approach to peace building and not the peace process itself. If you're interested in that, you can read about it in a policy brief I wrote about 2 months ago on women's voices in Yemen's peace process. That can also be found on Sana Center's website. But today I'll be sharing mostly the background and approaches of this current study, the main takeaways, the findings, recommendations, and conclusion. Over 8 years of war in Yemen has had dire consequences on people's day-to-day lives, and this has shaped their definitions and perceptions of peace. Yet warring factions, mostly male political elite, continue to monopolize the conversations on peace, marginalizing the voices of Yemenis. Local women's groups and peace activists, for example, have been playing significant roles in diffusing conflict and working to end the human rights abuses and violations, but their perspectives and experiences are largely ignored. So this study is unique because it draws heavily on feminist literature that argues that hidden, literally behind four walls, everyday practices carried out by women in procreation, day-to-day routines, caregiving, and social relations are integral and key to social cohesion. And these could help frame and construct community practice that will lead to peace on the ground. So utilizing a community-centered approach, our research seeks to give agencies to Yemenis to define peace based on their own lived experiences, to propose practices that will promote women's roles in peace building, and suggest ways to mitigate practices that produce or reproduce gender inequalities and violence. In terms of the methodology, the findings were derived from focus group discussions with 128 men and women in Yemen, carried out between January and March 2022, as well as semi-structured interviews with leaders, meaning decision makers and religious leaders, community leaders as well, in Sana'a, Eb, Aden, and Hadramaut, across rural and urban regions of this parts of this regions. So regarding the main takeaways, I will share some of the main takeaways that I'll talk about today. The respondents in the focus group discussions, both women and men, had similar definitions of peace with some regional differences. The respondents agreed that women play a critical role in peace building, but they have limited public engagement and they face social stigma. Also, existing peace building work in Yemen is viewed by many as foreign, more like a Western concept. Religious discourse in Yemen was also found to be both empowering and restricting for women. Now, based on the findings from the study, Yemeni women and men participating in the study were asked what peace meant to them. And as you can see here, the definitions of peace were mostly from a human security lens, centered around security, stability, access to basic needs, freedom, meaning mobility and speech, peace as Islam, as Islamic values, and peace as dignity. Human security is crucial for for achieving peace, as it prioritizes the protection and empowerment of individuals over the security of the states. Yemenis who have been in the midst of a grave humanitarian crisis have been denied access to the most basic needs. I'm talking of food, healthcare, infrastructure. So I can't stress this enough. But true peace can only be achieved when people go about their everyday lives feeling secure and are able to meet their basic needs. So if we generally want to achieve sustainable peace in Yemen, protecting individuals, including the most vulnerable, and prioritizing human security is key. Islam was also an important lens through which Yemeni respondents articulated their definition of peace. Islamic values were cited by the participants, emphasizing coexistence, rejection of war and violence, peaceful attitudes, behaviors, and so on. However, many did mention that the ongoing conflict in Yemen has disrupted these peaceful tenets, and social cohesion is increasingly being threatened in their communities. So our recommendations based on these definitions are peace-building efforts in Yemen have to prioritize human security, including implementing measures that will address the root cause of conflict and promote social cohesion and reconciliation. We also highly recommend integrating Islamic values into human security frameworks, as this can help ensure that peace is achieved in a way that is consistent with cultural and religious traditions of Yemeni people. Peace-building projects that are promoting peace at grassroots levels should also integrate the local definitions that we found through this study. Now, when we asked the respondents about women's roles in spaces for peace building, women's roles were mostly associated with the private sphere. However, in the public sphere, women's roles were mostly associated with human rights and humanitarian roles. Now, in conflict settings, many feminist theorists have argued that women's peace activism is not due to some inherent peaceful nature of theirs, but generally in response to the distress that they experience or that is caused by conflict and displacement. And I'll be talking about this more later. Now, in the private sphere, women's peace-building roles were highly talked about, and specifically mothers are seen as primary peace builders in Yemeni society, responsible for raising peaceful children and promoting values such as peace and love. Now, in Yemen, becoming a mother is highly valued and respected. Mothers play important roles in social relationships within families, tribes, and neighborhoods. They also play reconciliatory roles during conflicts within these spaces. Social gatherings that we call munasabat, that bring together mothers and women, play important roles in building resilience, empowerment, and self-confidence among women. So these are also important spaces for promotion of peace and peaceful practices to the community. Now, while Yemeni society views women as primary peace builders, responsible for instilling peaceful values in their children, not all women and mothers hold peaceful beliefs. Some have been found to contribute to the war by mobilizing young boys as combatants, joining warring armed groups, or serving as members of intelligent networks. These instances of women propagating violence are emerging in Yemen, but they represent a minority. Now, another role of women in peace building is as educators in spaces that are considered an extension of the home or the private sphere. Alongside mothers, female teachers were also perceived as playing an important role in promoting peace and nonviolence. Some female teachers in our focus groups voiced concern on how the war in Yemen has led to an increase in violent behavior among youth, mostly stemming from increased fear and insecurity as well as instability. And this is a significant obstacle to building peace, which were mostly voiced by respondents from the north part of the country. Now, segregated spaces in mosques were also mentioned by female respondents. Mosques provide safe spaces where women can congregate and educate each other. Several examples were given of female Islamic preachers, we call them sheikha or da'iya, in mosques that promote peaceful values and behaviors, and they can combat violence and empower women. But this doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. So based on this, our recommendations are that within women's spaces, we recommend implementing awareness programs that can increase local communities' understanding of peace building projects and the indispensable role of mothers and women in promoting peace and peaceful practices. Now, an important opportunity toward promoting peaceful practices and values is through training teachers, female and male, on how to promote peaceful values and practices while combating the spread of violence. We also need to actively engage female Islamic preachers exploring and promoting interpretations of Islamic texts that empower women and their roles as peace builders through sermons, lectures, workshops in mosques, and in women's spaces. Now that I've talked about the roles of women in private sphere and the private sphere, I would like to bring your attention to the traditional peace building roles of women that were echoed by our participants. The discussants noted how, unlike foreign aid projects, where peace-building projects are often short-term, traditions of conflict resolutions are embedded in Yemeni culture. Yemeni families are traditionally large, and family disputes are often the first conflicts women handle. So from the focus groups, we found that spaces where women carry their day-to-day activities prove to be important catalysts for empowerment, but also for conflict resolution practices. So women are highly valued as mediators in many Yemeni communities, often called to resolve conflict or disputes between families, to reconcile couples, and even convince men to reconsider divorce. For example, women in Hadramaut, the east central part of Yemen, were said to have a long history of taking part in traditional peace-building roles as reconciliators, and they are viewed as catalysts for peace. Women's roles as mediators is also recognized among tribes, and tribal customs often grant women advantages that they can use to prevent violence and stop fighting. For instance, tribal customs prohibit targeting a man who is accompanied by a woman, even if he has committed murder. And a wanted man may seek the protection of women until that issue is resolved. So women do work behind the scenes to pressure men and de-escalate problems and create concessions. As one of the participants noted, often this happens at home rather than during meetings, which are often dominated by men. So when discussing topics of peace building and women's role in peace building, it may be more effective to use terminologies such as conflict resolution, as these traditions are familiar and deeply woven within the social fabric of the country. Now, women in the humanitarian role in public sphere were mostly identified in the humanitarian roles or in humanitarian rights sector, either with local or international organizations. It's important to know that humanitarian organizations, both local and international, have been filling the gap left by the state and addressing the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. So as I mentioned earlier, women's peace activism is not due to some inherent peaceful nature of theirs, but generally in response to the distress caused by conflict as we see around the world. Similarly, in Yemen, women-led organizations and solidarity networks have also emerged, and many are doing commendable work on the ground. As an example, the Abductees Mothers Association is one of the most active organizations in Yemen that monitors, documents, and negotiates the exchange and release of abductees and detainees. So some of the challenges that women peace activists face in the public sphere are that societal customs and traditions work against them. There are also restrictions and regulations that have been imposed by authorities to limit their mobility and participation in public life. Peace building work is often viewed as a Western concept, which hinders the work of organization and women in peace building work. Some religious leaders are inciting against women in mosques and sermons, as some sheikhs espouse extremist and conservative interpretations of Islam that restrict women's participation in the public sphere. So some religious leaders are also skeptical of international organizations' role in promoting peace. And women who are publicly active in peace building in Yemen sometimes face social stigma and smear campaigns, which hinders their work and reputation of women in the field. So our recommendation based on that is that we need to engage with men as partners and advocates for female peace builders. We need to encourage women, men, and local groups to utilize their language to define peace-related terminologies like the WPS agenda using cultural understandings when promoting peace and women's empowerment at the local level. We also need to engage with religious leaders and influential figures in designing peace-building projects that would promote women's roles. We need to find ways to bring religious leaders and influential figures in Yemen into discussion with respected local women actors and local groups to promote women's roles in peace building. Female Islamic preachers also can play a role in challenging gender inequalities and empower women through religious arguments and counter extremist narratives. We also need to pressure the relevant authorities to retract on policies that undermine women's rights, such as mobility restrictions, insightful rhetoric, and violence that they face, and implement laws that will punish these insightful language against women to safeguard their rights, their movement, and their safety. If possible as well, implement awareness campaigns within community spaces, women and men's spaces, that will increase understanding of peace building projects to mitigate the negative image associated with working in the field of peace. Now, in conclusion, I would like to say that women's peace building roles associated with the private sphere are generally associated with the private sphere or extensions of it. Women mediate disputes and practice daily practices and resilience, which need to be better recognized and integrated into peace building frameworks. Female peace builders face social stigma and harassment, which needs to be addressed. Female Islamic preachers in Yemen can play an important role in empowering women through religious arguments. Religious and community leaders can also play an important role to mitigate harmful practices stemming from the spread of increasingly extreme religious ideologies. And lastly, we believe that a localized approach that involves the community, meaning leaders, influential figures, men and women, and utilizing cultural and religious frameworks could prove more appealing to local communities that are skeptical of the current peace frameworks in Yemen. And with that, thank you so much. Yes, that is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maryam. I was just going to tell you to slow down a bit because it was difficult to keep up, but thank you very much. Let's move on to Bilqis. Bilqis, I think you have a few questions that you would like to ask our guest speakers, so please go ahead. We also have a few questions in the chat, Bilqis, if you could please share them. So we have two questions. If the questions could be translated. Okay, if you could please start with your question, and if there's any similar questions, I'll include them. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Bilqis Al-Lahabi. I am an advisor working on this project and the gender advisor for the Sana Center in Jeddah. I would like to welcome all of my dear friends and colleagues. This webinar is important because it's being led by young women, young Yemeni women who have also led this project. At the Sana Center, we're very keen, and I think that after the very difficult experiences that we've gone through, we are keen to ensure that there is inclusiveness and participation, not just from women, but different generations. Huda Jafar, in addition to being a very dear friend of mine, is someone who is specialist in monitoring and evaluation. She is also a film critic and is well known in the arts. And Huda, you did work that was very important, and this was the field research that was a part of this project. You've spent a lot of time with, and you've heard things that cannot be easily summarized in research papers. So I wanted to ask you, what was interesting to you during the focus group discussions, and also were there any anecdotes or stories or anything that was said during these discussions that you found very interesting? You also heard the recommendations and participated in writing these recommendations. Is there any other recommendation that you would like to add in addition to the ones that Maryam presented? Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Bilqis. Thank you, Reem. Thank you, Dr. Maryam. Can you hear me clearly? Yes, yes, we can hear you very well. Please continue. I will try to answer as briefly as possible because I don't want to take any more time than I already have. With regards to the recommendations in research like this, it's usually very difficult to differentiate between the personal recommendations and the political recommendations. Usually they're presented as being the same. But if there is an additional recommendation that I would like to add, and maybe even a comment, it would be that the relationship between state institutions in both Hadramaut and Aden governorates, the relationship between state institutions and civil society in Aden and in Hadramaut is better than the relationship between state institutions and civil society in Sana'a and Ib. Like Dr. Maryam said when presenting the research, when we were working on laying the foundation for it, we wanted to ensure that there was equal focus on both the areas under the so-called legitimate or the internationally recognized government and those under the de facto authorities or the Houthis. And what we noticed is that the relationship between state institutions and civil society in Aden and in Hadramaut was better than the relationship between state institutions and civil society in Sana'a and Ib. I don't think that this is due to the Houthis. I don't think that that is a direct reason for it. I don't think that the relationship between state institutions and civil society in Ibn Sana'a is because of the community, but because of the Houthis themselves. And because of how the Houthis have incited and carried out smear campaigns against civil society organizations in the areas. Secondly, in Aden and Hadramaut, and this is something that I want to make clear to the participants, especially the non-Yemenis here. I don't know if you knew this, but with the presence of the Houthis in Sana'a, there are calls to grant those of Hashemite lineage more power in the state. And this is not the case in Hadramaut and in Aden, these kinds of sensitivities. One of the reasons for this is because Hadramaut is a stronghold or has a high concentration of Sufis, not just in the south, but in Yemen as a whole. And this is one of the main reasons why this issue is not a contentious issue in Hadramaut and in Aden. Secondly, the southern areas, Aden, Hadramaut, Shabwa, and Abyan, were never under the control or the rule of the Zaydi Imams, unlike other areas. And so this issue was not as sensitive a topic as it was in other areas. And so that's another thing that we've noticed. The third point, talk about the respondents themselves, the female respondents specifically. The political conflict in Yemen, as much as it has increased the burden that women have to bear, it has also, we also noticed that the conflict has given them an opportunity to be in positions that they never had a position or never had an opportunity to be in before, like the private sector. For women, for example, to have an opportunity to open up small businesses and start selling things. So when one of the governors, one of the women said that this was a positive development. And this wasn't just one of the respondents, there were several. They said that before the war, they did not, they were not employed or they did not work, but after the war, they were able to open up their businesses, one of whom said that she was making incense at home and selling it. I don't want this to be understood as saying that we're trying to romanticize the war, we're trying to make it seem like it's really not that bad or not all bad, but these are just some of the but these were just some of the points of view that may not have been as popular or mentioned as much among the respondents that we discussed the issue with. Another point is that several of the respondents said that the respondents mentioned many examples of women who are working to resolve domestic disputes or disputes within families or neighborhoods, that these were women who were middle-aged, who were or older, and who were not well known on social media. These were people who weren't very popular, that weren't but played a very important role in their local communities. And they said that these were women who were well known in their areas. They were known to work in resolving conflicts and mediating disputes, especially within families. And these were women, I was surprised to find, that weren't well known outside of their areas. But what drew my attention was that the participants told me that these women don't work with civil society organizations, and that this was actually a reason for their work being more sustainable, because they told me that the women who work within civil society organizations or as a part of projects, their work and the impact that they have ends as soon as the contract ends or as soon as the project duration ends. But women who work with their communities, their work is much more sustainable. Some of the participants also said that it was very important to try to unify the efforts, women's efforts in peace building, and that it is important to institutionalize them, whether within civil society organizations or in a way that is more organized than it is currently. And this was another point of view by some of the participants. One of the anecdotes that was interesting to me, it's always very surprising whenever we conduct research like this, especially in focus group discussions, and this is something that civil society organizations and donors need to keep in mind, that civil society is already steps ahead of what international organizations are doing. If a donor or an organization wants to better understand how they can help a local community, I think the easiest and most straightforward way to do that would be to ask that community what they need. Another one of the influential stories that we heard was that some of the participants, especially the women, they'd be able to complete each other's sentences, that they all seemed to be very closely in agreement, that they knew, even if they were meeting for the first time, they faced many of the same problems, many of the same experiences, many of the same situations, even across the different governorates. That women know the suffering that other women in other areas are going through, that they're going through similar circumstances. And as similar as the situation is between the Yemeni governorates, there were also a lot of political, social, and cultural differences or specificities in each one of these governorates. The political situations, for example, and the military conflicts ongoing in these governorates were different. But despite that, the suffering or the burdens that women were bearing or were facing were very similar. This also applied to the men, but I'm going to be focusing on the women. There was a woman from a rural area that participated, and she was very emotional and was crying throughout while giving her answers, because she remembered how her father forced her to marry at a young age and she couldn't study, and now her daughter, who is 16 years old, is facing a very similar fate, because the husband has already been selected for her, and the girl's father and uncle were insistent that she get married and not continue her studies. And this was something that was very memorable for me, to hear the story from the mother. And so these were some of the interesting points from the research that I found. I don't want to take too long, but I wanted to reiterate that organizations and donors need to focus more on what society, what the local communities say, what they need, and to take these needs into account for peace building or for anything else, especially in light of the ongoing conflict and the security and political situation. These differences need to be taken into account. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bilqis. Back to you. Thank you very much, Huda. I'm not just thanking you for this very important addition and comments that you've made, but I also wanted to thank you for your extraordinary efforts on the research. We know the difficulty of communicating and working out in the field. We know the many obstacles that you face when working in Yemen, as well as the lack of support for many of these kinds of projects that look into what Yemenis think. There's a question from the chat that said, if sustainable peace is possible, then why don't the parties to the conflict and the international community and the Iranians and the Chinese, why don't they focus on this? And I think that Huda responded to this, that civilians who are affected by the conflict have more advanced views or perspectives on the peace process than the parties to the conflict and those who have an interest. Because these civilians, these local communities have an interest in peace, unlike the parties to the conflict who have an interest in the war continuing. And hearing from the people, not just women, but civilians in general who are affected. And we hope that everyone can hear these voices and to listen to them and to base their negotiations and their positions on the process on the voices of the people who are most affected by it. A webinar like this one that focused on interviews, it was very important for us to bring in two of these respondents. Sarah Al-Jabri and Leila Shabibi are not just any respondents. They are two young women who have gotten involved in the peace process, not just as employees of an organization, because there are many other people who are working on these kinds of issues just as a job, but there are people who do it from more of a personal motive. And this approach is reflected in the work that they do and their interaction with the people that they work with. Starting with Leila, what is the nature of the activities that you are working on, and how do these activities support the peace process or peace building in general? And how would you describe your relationship with the state institutions and with the authorities? If you could please respond to these questions in 5 or so minutes. Leila is very active in civil society, but she is also the manager of the Akun Foundation in Aden, which focuses on the peace process and which focuses specifically on women and their role in peace and peace building. Thank you very much, Bilqis. I'm very happy to be here. Unfortunately, I can't turn on my camera because of how bad the internet connection is here in Aden. With regards to the work that we are doing, I think in many people's point of view, many people believe that the work that we're doing is very easy, whether this is my own personal work or the work that we do as institutions. But unfortunately, that is not the case. It isn't an easy activity to carry out. For women to become involved in the public sphere, we see that their spaces are becoming much more and more limited, and the presence of women in the public sphere is becoming more and more linked to organizations or their employment in them. I work with youth on protection projects, whether for women working in these fields or women who are at risk of gender-based violence, which has unfortunately decreased or increased during the war. And we provide legal support, we provide psychosocial support to them, and try as much as possible to change how society views these women. In Aden, the challenges that women face are much fewer than the challenges that women in rural areas face. I think it is easier for us here in Aden to interact with the authorities, whether they're the central authorities or the national government authorities or the local authorities in the governorate, which are the authorities of the internationally recognized government. But unfortunately, there are still difficulties when we try to interact or work with decision makers to discuss the issues that are of concern to us. With regards to the peace efforts that we are working on, we work primarily on community peace and safety, which is a very important issue that requires work at this time, especially with the extensive demographic changes, not just in Aden, but all of the other governorates because of the movement of IDPs that have led to different customs and traditions spreading to areas that they had not been practiced before. And these views coming in from rural areas are usually much more conservative and have a much more limited space for women to operate in. And so in Aden, we try to discuss these issues, how they relate to society, how they relate to youth or women. And we do this not just in the field that we work in the areas that we operate in, but also through advocacy campaigns through which we try to work with all relevant actors inside and outside Yemen to convey these messages and ensure that the recommendations that we get from the local communities are conveyed to decision and policy makers. And unfortunately, despite the efforts that we're working on, we still feel that there are many difficulties, especially with the political changes occurring in Yemen, and which affect the peace process and projects and peace building. And these changes also affect the local communities. Back to you, Bilqis. Thank you very much, Leila.
يبدو اهتماما واضحا من قبل الحاضرين.
It seems like there's a very clear focus by the attendees of the attendees here of the webinar about the role of female preachers and religious leaders and empowering women in peace building, as well as what negative role they can play. Sara al-Jabri comes from a religious background. She has a master's in Islamic studies and Islamic law and works to raise awareness among women about peace building. And she's also the project manager at the Al-Usra Saeeda, or the Happy Family Foundation. Sarah, you will get many questions during the Q&A section of this webinar, but I wanted to start by asking you the same questions that I asked Leila. What is your role, or what activities do you work on in peace building? How would you describe the work that you carry out? And also, how would you describe your relationship with both the community and with the authorities? Thank you very much, Bilqis. Peace be upon you. I think that my colleagues have spoken a lot about peace building, but our role as female religious leaders is also a very important role in our community. Most of the people that have worked in this have focused on civil society role, but also from our point of view, from the Islamic perspective, we've worked on this in numerous ways. First, by providing support to the women and by advocating for this in the women who attend prayers, for example. We also conduct field visits and try to provide information relating to the issues that are of concern to the local communities and what the perspective is on that. Also by supporting the economic empowerment of women. And the economic empowerment of women is important through training, through workshops. And these are things that are permissible in our religion. And this is also part of what we would term missionary work, or calling these women in the local communities and advocating for this perspective. And this was the role that the female companions of the Prophet did, like Khawla bint al-Azwar. She was one of the female companions of the Prophet. Khadija also was one of the very first Muslims, and she was a woman. And so if we go back to the time of the Prophet, the awareness around peace building wasn't just the role of men, but women were also heavily involved in these activities. We also believe that it's very important that women are able to express their opinions on the issues that they face in their community. What are their views, for example, on the displacement? With the ongoing situation in the country, women play a very important and very integral role for their communities. There's a huge difference between the role of women before 2015 and the role now. Their role now is as educators, as heads of household, as breadwinners. And this is why it's very important for women to be encouraged and to be supported. Women can provide a very important support for their families, improving their economic conditions and their living conditions. And so this is why it's very important for us to work towards raising awareness about what peace building is, what role women can play in it, and what societies and local communities can do for themselves after the conflict, in the post-conflict stage. We as female preachers have an important role because we have a close relationship with the women in the community, and we also have an important link to foundations and to organizations, and anything that is of concern to women is a field that we can play a role in. We can play a role through the women's gatherings, through women's classes. And this role is very important to raise awareness and to advocate among women about what the role could be in peace building and how we can support this role and how we could ensure that this role grows stronger. And it's also very important for us to ensure that these women know that Islam did not curb their role, that women have an Islamic right to carry out a role in the public sphere and the private sphere based on the customs and traditions of our religion.
شكرا.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
أعتقد إن كان في جوانب من الجوانب ليلى وسارة
I think that some of the aspects of
يعني ما جاوبونيش فيهم علاقتهم بالسلطة والمجتمع.
some of the questions that I asked of Sarah and Leila were not answered, especially with regards to the relationship with the authorities and the communities. But in the next part, I will continue to ask some questions, and Reem will also ask some questions from the participants. From the beginning of the webinar, we've been talking about what practices women have been working on the ground that help contribute to peace building, or at least maintain the cohesiveness of their communities to ensure that peace building in the future will not be as difficult. Can you give any clear examples of processes that women are leading in their daily lives that will help decrease the cost of peace building in the future, of how women are maintaining the bare minimum of social peace and cohesion in their communities? We'll start with Sarah and then Leila, but if you could please give us some real life examples, and I think this will be the best way to illustrate the role that women have. So back to you, Sarah. There are some examples in peace building. If we talk about, for example, economic, the empowerment of women. In the past, women were not empowered. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Sarah. But if you could give a clear example, some of the practices or behaviors of women that you've actually worked with on the ground, and to what extent can these daily practices or activities help build peace now or decrease the cost of peace building in the future? And so do you have any clear real life examples of these kinds of activities? There were many examples that we saw. So, for example, we saw a lot of women who worked in mediating family disputes in their communities. A lot of the women have also formed local community committees to try to work on mediating efforts, to raise awareness about peace building and spread the concept of peace, and what role women can play in this, not just in their homes, but also in the fields that they work in the public sphere, and anywhere else that they operate, on what exactly peace means and what role women can have in it. And so do you mean that these are actually practices that you can see on the ground in a woman? And we know that war also has an impact on relationships, not just in the community, but within a family, that there's an increase in the use of violence towards against children, against women, against more vulnerable groups. Thank you very much, Sarah, for your answer. Leila, to what extent, we know that there are differences in each one of our respective communities, but in your community, to what extent have you seen women carrying out activities and practices that work to build peace and decrease the cost of peace building in the future? Thank you very much, Bilqis. I think in Aden it's very clear. There are many different initiatives and women's groups that operate in Aden. Some of them have very clear programs that have been adopted by local or international organizations, like the Noon Coalition, which had a project that was more developmental than social. And in this project, they tried to focus on areas that where there was armed violence, and they worked to resolve a lot of the community disputes. I'm sorry, so you said that it was a developmental project, but what kind of solutions did it have? So most people believe that peace building has nothing to do with development, but the way we're looking at it is there's an important nexus between development and peace building, that we need developmental projects that help support peace building, that help resolve many of these projects. Could you give us an example, Leila? Do you have any real-life examples of people who used, for example, whether work for cash for work or in carrying out repairs or renovation? So at this stage of the project, the Noon Coalition has implemented 6 projects at the funding level is $20,000, which is very limited or very small for the types of activities that they did. So one of the activities, for example, was that they repaired and covered the sewage system in a school for those with special needs. And this was a problem that had been going on for a very long time, and none of the authorities were able to resolve it, but the Noon Coalition was able to. They also were able to repair the sewage system in the criminal investigation department. This was in the women's prison or the women's jail in the CID, and the Noon Coalition was able to resolve them, especially because this problem affected primarily the women who were being detained in these areas. And so the Noon Coalition was able to coordinate with the Public Water and Sewer System Authority, in addition, and the local authorities and the CID to resolve these problems. And so as women, we want to ensure that our work isn't just limited to societal issues or family disputes or things in a very limited scope. We want to try to resolve these issues at their core and to intervene, whether through projects that are adopted by civil society organizations or by community contributions, where members of the local community raise money to resolve their issues through their efforts. And these kinds of initiatives, which are led by women, they bring together women from different social classes or from different groups, whether these are women who work with those with special needs, they're lawyers or educators, or even women in the local authorities. And so these experiences have been very positive. Thank you very much, Leila. I think women always find that they have to continue to justify their participation and that their role is important and that their roles and their activities are very important for the cohesion of their community. And this war has led to the state and the de facto authorities giving up on their responsibilities towards civilians and not providing services. And the lack of provision of these services lead to increased conflict and competition within communities. But Leila, what is the biggest challenge that women face in their interventions and their peace-building initiatives outside of these traditional frameworks? Is the biggest challenge that they face from the traditional or conservative societies, or do they face the biggest challenge from the authorities and the de facto actors? And so do you find that society is the one that is rejecting or not cooperating or not working with women, or is it the authorities, whether they are armed forces or de facto or state institutions, the ones that pose the biggest challenge? Leila? I think first the local communities, when they the local community is more accepting of women's initiatives if these initiatives are focused on women's issues. But and unfortunately, the authorities are the ones who stand against women's initiatives and women's efforts. They aim primarily to marginalize women, to exclude them. And this isn't just from a single anecdote or from a single experience. There have been several initiatives in Aden and in other governorates where women have proven that they are able to work with the local communities, no matter how conservative it is. Sorry for interrupting you again, Leila. We know that there have been many experiences and there have been many attempts and initiatives, and this is something that we can discuss for many, many hours, but we will try to ask the same question of Sarah. Sarah, the work that you've done is in a very important field, and it's something that's very close to the community. And so with all of these efforts that women carry out, whether they are resolving conflicts within their families or working with their communities and neighborhoods, have you found that most of this opposition comes from to women's initiatives or activities comes from the society itself or from the authorities and state institutions and de facto authorities? Thank you. Also, Bilqis, I would like to answer to the previous question. There have been a few examples that I didn't mention. That there was work that we did with the NDI where we worked on raising awareness and advocacy with regards to gender-based violence and also the spread of drugs in the local communities and how to curb it. And also the second question that you had, there is the women are able to work on it, but most of the obstacles that they face come from societal traditions and customs. Also, another challenge that women have seen is from the patriarchal authorities. In our field visits and in our advocacy campaigns, if they see women, especially if they see that women are becoming more involved, then they view them differently. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we face is the patriarchal authority and also the traditions and customs that we see in these local communities. Thank you very much, Sarah. And Leila, thank you very much for this clarification, which will help the participants better understand this. In the presentation, it was said that to what extent are women able to carry out these activities, but their efforts are underappreciated. And so my question is to Sarah, do you find that society appreciates the work that you are doing? Do you feel like there's community appreciation and recognition of the work from society as a whole, both men and women? Do you find that they appreciate the work you're doing? Thank you, Bilqis. I don't think it's the same. I think it's unequal. There are people who recognize, who accept this work, whereas others who view that you playing a role as a woman outside of your house, outside of your house is wrong. Some people are saying, oh, she's doing this for money. Some people say that this is unacceptable and shouldn't be acceptable in our society. And some people appreciate it. And like I said, the roles, the customs and traditions that we have in a society play a role, especially if a woman is religious, is conservative, if someone... And it also depends on the area. In certain areas, there are differing customs and traditions about women's participation in the public sphere or the public life. Also, the status of the woman, if they are married, if they are widows. And so it depends on many of these different factors. And the response by their communities is different, despite the fact that Islam has not prohibited women from playing this role, but has placed certain religious restrictions on how these interactions are carried out. And so the question is, as female preachers, how can we be role models for the rest of society to make it more accepting of this? And so my answer to the question is that it differs from one community to the next, from one person to the next. But I think all in all, majority of Yemeni society might be against this idea or the participation of women. Sarah, do you think that most of the women who work in this field, is their biggest fear of being stigmatized? Is it of the reputations being tarnished? Are there more security or personal safety-based fears? Are they more economic fears? And so what are the types of fears and concerns that women working in this field, in resolving family disputes, for example, or working on advocacy and the other charitable activities that you are involved in, what are their main concerns? Well, first, most of the challenges that they face, that women in this field face, is first they don't find that there is a sufficient acceptance. For the men, for example, working in their field, they're less accepting of women participating in the field as well. But if you as a woman have these aspirations and you have these objectives and they're clear to you, and you're working to instill very specific objectives, and you have the confidence in yourself, and also it's important for you to have support from your own family. And if that is the case, then you can do whatever, and you don't have to worry about anyone else. Because otherwise, if you keep worrying about what other people will say, what society will say about us, then we'll never be able to do anything. Thank you very much, Sarah. I like your Hadrami accent, and it's always very interesting for me to hear. Back to you, Leila. I have the same question for you. Based on your experience, what are the biggest concerns that women have? And also, do you feel that your efforts are appreciated by your community? And also, what are the biggest fears that you have? Is it being stigmatized? Is it the political insecurity situation? Is it are the economic fears and concerns? And also, does society care about whether you do this on your own or from a religious point of view, or would they rather that you do this as a part of a civil society organization? Sorry, Bilqis, can you please repeat the question? The internet here is very bad. Yeah, again, this is also one of the biggest problems that we face, and I apologize for that, Leila. So, Leila, the question is, based on your experience, the work that you do, whether it is as an individual or within the institution that you are a part of, do you find that society is appreciative and does it recognize the work that you do? And so that was the first question. And then we'll take the rest. And so with regards to do we feel appreciated? I think that is the case. We do find that we are appreciative, especially in communities whose problems we were able to resolve, and the ones where we were able to reach consensus solutions. And this is something that I'm very proud of, especially when we work directly with the victims and vulnerable communities. We find that they're usually more appreciative. Yes, exactly. People who work with people and their suffering and tries to help them bear that burden has a very special and unique relationship. Back to the questions, what are the concerns that women working in this field have? Is it the security situation? Is it being stigmatized? I think my biggest fear is not being able to continue in this work. Is it economic concern, or is it that society will no longer be accepting of it, or is it a political or security threat? Well, first, the biggest question or concern is how long we'll be able to continue working in this field, and sometimes without even a break, without being able to take some time to rest and recuperate. And secondly is the overall situation, the overall political and security situation. Unfortunately, in Aden and many other areas, it feels like the situation, it's a ticking time bomb, that things could explode at any time, and it won't just affect me, but will affect society, my community as a whole. And one of the biggest concerns or fears that we have is of not being able to do anything, whether not being able to help people or not being able to even secure and ensure the safety of yourself and your family. And these are some of the biggest concerns that we have, and they're mostly linked to the political situation. When it comes to societal acceptance, is society more accepting if you work in an international organization or in a local organization, or when you work much closer with the community in a personal capacity? Society is more accepting when there is a personal or individual acceptance, because overall, the view of women in international organizations is that they're only there trying to implement an international agenda. They're working against Islam and against local customs and traditions, that you're trying to change their mind. And so we try to localize and Yemenize even the terminology that we use in our projects and our initiatives. We want to ensure that all of the programs and all of the mechanisms that we work on in the peace building projects are as Yemeni, are as grounded as much as possible in Yemeni culture and the Yemeni identity. And so that's something that we believe is very important. And also, if you work in local organizations and if you've been working in this community for a very long time, then it is usually much easier to work with this community and to continue working. But in local and international organizations, you work with different communities in different areas depending on the projects, and so you never build this long-lasting relationship with them. We'll continue with this and then go back to Sarah. Leila, you spoke about customs and traditions, as was shown in the research and in the study, and you also spoke about the importance of localizing this kind of work and these kinds of projects. And so, to what extent are the social customs and traditions a double-edged sword, that they might support the role that young men and women can play, and it can play a role in peace building, but it could also curb their effectiveness in the role? And so, to what extent can you benefit? Do you think it is possible to benefit from local traditions and customs to empower the role of women in peace building? I think it's very important for us to try to find the social customs and traditions that support women in this field. There are many different customs and traditions that can be used or that can be utilized to support the role of women. So, for example, in Aden, for a very long time, women have been involved in the public sphere, and they've been able to work outside their homes, and they've been able to work on different issues, and this has been accepted for a long time in Aden. So our role here is to try to encourage this. We meet with women who worked in different fields in the past. We learn more about their struggles, about their experience in working in this field. And we try to look into how we can use this expertise and use what they've learned and the lessons that they learned from their experiences in our in the context that we are in today. It's important to also ensure that we focus on the sensitivity, how sensitive society is to it. We don't want to try to impose what we believe is best for society. We need to look into, I think that society, if we take this sensitivity into account, is very important. And yes, exactly, extremism is there on both sides, whether those who believe that women shouldn't have any role in society, or some people that might believe that society can no longer administer its own affairs. Sarah, this question comes back to you. How can we benefit from the social traditions and customs, and how can we continue to empower the role of women when it comes to peace building specifically and the public sphere in general? Yes, I think that we can benefit a lot from the social customs and traditions, and there have been many experiences of that. But the more the community learns about peace building, what exactly it means, things start to change. And so the social traditions and customs, even not that long ago, were... Can you hear me? Yeah, yes, we can hear you, Sarah. Please continue. We can hear you. Can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you. I'm sorry, the internet here is very slow. Not too long ago, the role of women in local communities and Hadrami communities especially was substantial or was significant. women played a very active and influential role in Hadrami society. And this instilled the role of women in Hadrami society and in Hadrami tradition. Can you hear me? Yes, Sarah, we can hear you. Please continue. We can hear you.
أستاذة سارة تسمعينا؟
Sarah, can you hear us?
أستاذة سارة.
Sarah, can you hear us? Yes, we can hear you. Please continue. We also saw that the role of women in Hadrami society was a pioneering role, but unfortunately this role has become more limited. So Sarah, this brings us to a similar question that religiosity or religious, that this could also be seen, religion could be seen as a double-edged sword as well, that it can give these rights but also can restrict the rights of others. So to what extent do you think can religious preachers, religious influencers, to what extent can they contribute to peace building and to encouraging women to participate in the public sphere and in peace building specifically? I think that the religious preachers and figures can play a very important role in this. This is very important for women. They can play an important role in religious gatherings and religious events. Also, it's like I said before, that if we look at the time of Prophet Muhammad, there were female companions of the Prophet, and the Prophet would encourage them. And so there were women who did very important work in the field and played important roles in their communities. And this is something that we need to educate society about, that Islam did not come to keep women at home, that we need to play the same role. Women today need to play the same role that female companions did. There are many examples like Fatima, like Khawla, like Sumaya, like many of the female companions. These are excellent examples, and thank you. But if you could please just try to be as brief as possible. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sarah, but Leila, to what extent can religious leaders and religious scholars support women's role in this? We know that there is a lot of incitement in the masjids against women, and I think this is more of caused by the state or the authorities than actual religious figures. But what do you think can be the role of this? Honestly, I don't know specifically, because there's been systematic campaigns against women from some of these religious groups, and this is the problem that we face. Honestly, we don't know how to deal with this issue, especially with the changes that have occurred in society, with the changes to schools. It's also not clear why women are being in civil society or in the public sphere in general are being targeted in this way. If we can try to be more moderate in religion, and we find that even some of the religious extremists also refuse to work with religious moderates. And we've lost many of the moderate preachers and religious leaders who were assassinated over the past period. And these were people who we were able to work closely with to discuss women's issues and to empower them, and they participated in our projects. But unfortunately, now many of the new religious leaders do not do that. Thank you very much, Leila. I think that what we see is that war targets those who are moderates, that war encourages extremism, whether they are religious or social extremists or political extremists, become much more prominent and influential during conflicts. Reem, should we continue with some of the questions on the recommendations, or do you want to take some questions from the participants? We tried as much as possible. Thank you, Bilqis. We tried as much as possible to. We know that this is a very important topic, and we can talk about it for a very long time. But we'll try to be as brief as possible to finish within the next 13 minutes. I'll open the floor for Maryam. I have a few questions for Maryam from the participants. We also need Maryam and Huda if they have anything to add from the discussion between Bilqis and Sarah and Layla. And so Maryam and Huda, there are a few questions. Let's start with Maryam. I'll try to gather all the questions. And then you can add any comments you might have on this topic and its relationship with the study. So the first question was on the recommendations. How can we make these recommendations more practical in the post-conflict situation? How can they become actual activities? And secondly, have the researchers found that local conflicts and traditions can be, or tribal mediation mechanisms, can they be used to resolve political conflicts? And can women in tribal areas use these tribal mediation customs and traditions to resolve political conflicts and not just tribal conflicts? Another question is, why was there a focus? Why wasn't there more of a focus on economic empowerment in this research? And there was a question of whether we have focused on the private sector in the study, and I responded saying that we had not, but I might be wrong, and there might have been a focus on this in your research. So please go ahead, Maryam, if you could please give us any comments you might have on the discussion.
Shukran. Thank you so much. I will try to answer them as concise as I can be because of time restraints. I did read some of the questions, and thank you for summarizing them, Reem. I just wanted to mention and to answer both the first and second questions with regards to the recommendation becoming more practical post-conflict. There are definitely many ways we can do this. Actually, it would be maybe even more feasible post-conflict than during the conflict due to the instability in the country. But I do think that one way that we can do this is these local women actors right now that we don't hear on media, who don't really work with organizations. If we're able to create networks to support them, to provide them with one sort of network to reach to each other and support and empower each other, I do think that is one way in which we can utilize their expertise and their skills, as well as create a network which is stronger. And to answer the second question, this network can now be used to bring to discussions with influential figures, and that will give them a way towards peacemaking at, we call it track 2 and track 1 in peace building and peacemaking, which generally means at the level of actual dialogue at the political level. So definitely, I think we need to create a platform and to sort of integrate all these women within this platform to be able to work together and to sort of channel their power towards empowering other women and towards the political stage, that is. In terms of why economic sector was not covered, it is covered. I highly recommend that everybody please read the paper. It's over 50 pages. We have covered the economic sector as well. It's just that it's 15 minutes. We didn't have much time for me to cover everything. So I just took the main things related to peace building, but I did also include, and my fellow researchers, we included the economic sector as well, and so many other examples. So yes, we can see how these tribal traditional approaches can be also used towards empowering other women and towards the taking women up to the political ladder, I would say. So I hope I was able to answer as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any additional comments on the discussion between Bilqis and Sarah and Layla?
بين بلقيس و
أنا يا ريم ولا؟
Was that a question from you, Reem? Yes, that was for you. Okay, yes. Sorry. What was your question? I wasn't paying attention. I asked if you had any comments to add on the discussion between Bilqis and Layla and Sarah.
Okay, I will continue in English. there were definitely, I think there were some very important points that were brought, specifically between the Layla and Sarah. Thank you very much for sharing those real life examples of ways in which people on the ground are actually bringing about change, specifically the importance of Islamic, female Islamic scholars and preachers. These are really important, and we have to understand why these are really important is because where we are today, there's not enough research on how these people on the ground, these whether they're Islamic preachers, whether they are actual secular activists, peace activists on the ground, how are they working together? We really are all disconnected. And we really need to bring everybody together to one platform to be able to hear the different and diversity in our ideas. And only then can we work together as one towards bringing peace building to Yemen. We are not functioning as separate entities. We need to create these kind of platforms and discussions towards a better Yemen and a better post-conflict society. So I do hope we have more of these. And there are so many great ideas that were shared in the questions. And I do think that this is one step that we have started towards bringing these discussions to the table. And without doing this, we cannot really bring change. It's easy to attack something and say, why didn't you talk about this? Or why didn't you talk about that? But how about we focus our energy onto, okay, what we have right now, how can we use it towards empowering Yemen, towards the future of Yemen, towards peace building? If you have a better idea, please share it with us. We'd love to explore it. And I really hope that the future of Yemen will be bright and we can be able to work together as women and men who support women as well towards building a sustainable and peaceful Yemen post-conflict. So thank you very much.
شكرا يا مريم. هدى عندك
Thank you, Maryam. Huda, do you have anything else to add?
كمان كان في أسئلة حول الأسئلة التي طرحت
Also a few questions
البحث وعينة
on some of the research questions and also the sample that was targeted and what was the response of the authorities. I don't know if this is something that we can find in the report and it doesn't need to be addressed here because you can just read it there, or would you like to address them here, Huda and Maryam? Sorry, Reem, can you please repeat the last question? I wanted to ask you, Huda, about any comments, anything you would like to add. And secondly, there were a few questions about who was the targeted sample, what were the questions that were asked, and also what was the response of the authorities, especially in the northern parts of the country. And so these questions, I don't know if they're addressed in the report, and so you would like to them to see it there. With regards to the discussion between Bilqis and Sarah and Layla, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me, Reem? Okay. The discussion between Bilqis and Sarah and Layla, something that drew my attention was something that Layla said. When Bilqis asked, what are things that you see in the local communities that you think we need to try to use to support the role of women in peace building? And I like the answer that Layla gave. She said, going back to what women's participation was like in Aden in the past. Because when we say returning to the past or returning to the customs and traditions, they think we're going back to something that occurred a very long time ago, something that is outdated and no longer applicable. But that is not the case in Yemen, in a city like Aden, and a city whose past is much better than its present. I think in that case, going back to the past might be the best solution. And so when we talk about the past, it doesn't necessarily mean that we go back to a rural way of thinking or a rural perspective. That is not the case. And for me, I personally believe that the context is the most important aspect. It's very important to understand the local context. It's the question and the answer. And so when we say, what are the things that we want to operationalize and use in a society, it depends on what city or what area we're talking about. Are we talking about Aden or Hadramaut or Ib or Ta'iz or Sana'a? Because each one of these areas, each one of these cities has their own unique history and the unique relationship between the men and women in these societies and communities. And this is one of the context specificities that we need to keep in mind, that the governorates, even while being similar in many ways, are also very different. And we could take advantage of these points to support the role of women in peace building. And so that's with regards to the discussion between Bilqis and Layla and Sarah. I also don't know, I don't know if there's time, but I wanted to say, as someone who's worked on this research, sometimes when in the midst of all this, we might not pay attention, but I was very appreciative of the bravery that Sarah Al-Jabri had for one has for them to do this. When you ask somebody, how were you able to do this? They might not really be able to talk about it, but I wanted Sarah to expand more on this. One of the stories that were mentioned, there was a woman who would come speak to Sarah, and she told her that she had been abused, and Sarah told her, you should go file a formal complaint about this, about you being abused or you being assaulted. And this is something that is very rare in the community. Where did Sarah get the audacity and the bravery to actually do this? Because socially, these issues are not accepted for a woman to file a report, and even religiously, in some views, this might not be acceptable for a woman to file a complaint like this. And this is something that I found very interesting, and I wanted to answer on behalf of Sarah. I think that for a woman to work in this field, she has to be very brave. She has to be, and sometimes she might not even recognize or realize how brave she's being. Another point I wanted to make, in Yemen, in any society, not just in Yemen, but the main engine is people's desire for security and stability. And to achieve this, they might do anything. They might even commit a crime to be able to reach this. And in Yemen, women want to guarantee their safety. And I know this is a much broader topic, but women in general feel like they are responsible for the security and stability of their families. And for them to achieve this, they sometimes encourage their sons to go join the fighting just so they can make money for the rest of the family. And so women who do not allow their children to go fight, what I want to say is that woman's nature is not 100% to be peaceable, because that's just who they are. That's their nature. I don't think that's true, but there are women who have encouraged their sons to go join the fighting, but the motivation is for the rest of their families to live and to be secure and to be stable. And so the women who do not allow their their children to go join the fighting might be doing so for the same motivation as the women who send their children to the fighting. Another point I wanted to make, and this was something that was said by by government official in Aden. I forgot his name, but he was a manager of executive office in Aden, and he said to us that women have been affected more by the war than men are, because there's no way for women to benefit from the war. And this is one of the things that was brought up in the chat. They said that women are the only ones who should mention peace, and this is what we can see, is because during the war there wasn't any case of women bearing arms and I don't know who said this, but I thank them for this comment. But this is not true. Women in some governorates have actually borne arms, and in Aden they participated. They weren't just sitting there at home throughout the whole conflict. And so it's important to keep this context. And secondly, even if women did not bear arms themselves, they might play a role of inciting their children or their husband to fight, not because they want to participate, but because they think that this might lead lead to security for themselves. This might lead to their family being able to survive rather than die of poverty. And so this idea of women not being the only ones not to participate in the violence, I think that is not true. I don't think that's the case. I think in many cases we've seen that women did incite violence, they bore arms regardless of the reasons, but the context and understanding this is very important. And so this idea of women being angels, of only working, I don't think that's true. Sorry for taking so long to answer this question. Back to you, Reem. Thank you very much, Huda. I think this is a great way to conclude the questions. With regards to the research questions, unfortunately, we don't have time to respond to that question. I think Maryam has already mentioned it. I think you can see more clearly in the report. Going back to Bilqis for her to conclude this session, but before that, I would like to thank everyone, thank the participants and attendees for being here with us throughout the hour and a half. And I also thank all the guest speakers. Thank you for sticking to the time, and thank you for putting up with Bilqis's dictatorial facilitation. Back to you, Bilqis. Just like Huda, similar to what Huda just concluded, that there is a need, not just a desire, but a need for security and stability, and that this is the main motivator for people. That just like it is said in the Quran, that people being able to survive and feel secure is a very important motivator. This was one of the reasons for people participating in the conflict, but women were not involved in these kinds of interests. Women were not involved in the interests of war, and so their interests in peace are much broader, and this is something that we need to work on without trying to focus on what the intentions are. Women are not angels. Women have their own interests, but they don't have an interest in the war as much as the men do, because they cannot form militias like men do. And social customs and traditions and the legacy, religious and cultural legacy, is very important as a double-edged sword. We need to ensure that we work within the Yemeni context while also not allowing the negative impact of these legacies to affect these activities. This is something that everyone working on peace building in Yemen needs to keep in mind. And this research by the Sana Center or by the donors, we can never claim that that this is the end all be all. I think the more we learn, the more we discover that there's a lot of things we don't know. And there are a lot of repeated recommendations, there's a lot of traditional points of view, but the reason that a lot of recommendations are repeated is because the needs have remained in large part the same. Yemeni, we need to hear more Yemeni voices, and this needs more and more work for Yemeni voices to actually be heard, because these voices aren't heard. And unfortunately, this being a proxy conflict ensures that Yemeni's voices are heard less and less the longer this continues. And just like my dear colleague Amat Salam Al-Hajj has said, the mother of abductees and detainees, that peace starts with mothers, that peace starts with mothers who are in pain because of their children being killed or injured or going hungry, and the responsibilities that these women have borne. These responsibilities, it's true that women were able to work in new fields and have been able to get more maybe authority than they have, but these come with restrictions that women will pay the price of from their health and from their time, and even maybe not being able to have any of these gains be sustainable in the future or permanent, with women being asked to go back to where they were before the war, when the war ends. We need to think about to what extent can peace building link development and rights. Can it work to confront gender-based violence through different institutions and measures? In the past, women faced violence from the traditions and the cultural legacy, but now we're also facing violence from the authorities at all levels, whether these are the formal authorities or what are the so-called internationally recognized authorities or any of the other de facto authorities on the ground. Thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you to the guest speakers. We wanted this session to be led by women and to try to give women as much time as possible, because this is a celebration of their efforts. We thank everyone for being here, especially the men who were here. This was an important test to how concerned you are with women's issues without having a chance to speak about them. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Huda, Sarah. Thank you, Leila, and Maryam, Reem. Thank you, Reem, for facilitating and for directing this project. And thanks to the Sana'a Center's media team who helped us. Thank you, Hamza, for being here with us and for helping set up this activity. We wish for nothing but peace for Yemen and for Yemeni mothers and Yemenis everywhere. Thank you very much.